And if I haven't had the chance to meet you, my name is Phil. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here at the Square, and just so honored to be with you. Can't wait for Saturday just to get to celebrate together Christmas Eve, and just really hope you're having an amazing season, just focusing on the person of Jesus and time with family and friends. Today, I get to bring a close to the teaching series that we've been walking through together over the Advent season, called There Is a Light. And today, I want to speak to you of what I believe the invitation is, not only from John, who writes to us as he's telling us something unique about the person of Jesus through this imagery of light and darkness, but what I believe is the invitation of the heart of God over us as a church. And in fact, the reason that my heart burned to do this teaching series together with you. And I've been in this for a while because it wasn't just that I was preparing for a teaching series, but over the last really 4 or 5 months, I've been working on writing the chapters of the Advent book that we've been going through, and around what does it really mean that John wants to invite us to understand that Jesus is the true light of the world. 2 nights ago, I was putting my son Cyrus down to bed. He's 6 years old, and bedtime with Cyrus is always fun. And I was putting him to bed and did our normal routine and spent time together and tucked him in and kind of he was good. He was tucked in and went downstairs for the evening. And maybe about 5 minutes later, I got that call. And if you're a parent, you know this, the dad, it always goes up. It always escalates up in tone, dad, And so I went upstairs and I said, hey, bud, you okay? And he said, it's too dark. I said, oh, okay. So I adjusted some of the light and the open doors and the different lights. I was trying to get it to right. And I sit down and he was feeling afraid of the dark. And he asked me, he goes, Dad, when you were a little boy, were you afraid of the dark? And I said, actually, Cyrus, I was, right? And I know everybody has different things they experience as kids. Some do, some don't. But I said, I actually really, there was a season where I was like really afraid of the dark. And I was trying to explain to him, I didn't tell all these stories because it would have made it worse. But my older brother, 6 years older than me, is about the sweetest human being that could exist. I don't have a memory of my older brother being unkind to me. He's a really great guy. His friends, not so much, right? His friends took the place of a typical older brother. And I grew up in Idaho. We grew up in this split level kind of house that, had like a walk-in level and a little bit upstairs, a little bit downstairs. But the downstairs was a basement. So it was basically all the way built underneath the ground. So it was dark, and the windows didn't really give any light, and there wasn't a light switch in that part of the house. There was just a lamp in the farthest corner of the room. So the only way to get light on was you had to walk through the darkness for a little while, right? But even worse is that then there was like this crawl space. There was this little door, it opened up, and there was this 4-foot level crawl space. And my brother's friends used to tell me these stories about how my parents had a kid they didn't want, just threw him in the crawl space, and his name was Screech, and he was always, I was scared of him, right? And even one time they actually they locked me in that room. I remember my older brother coming to my rescue, but I was a little afraid of being in that room alone, right? And there were these moments, I think it was about 6, 7 years old, and I would stand at the top of the stairs. I would ask my parents, can you go downstairs and turn on the light? Like the first few times, I think they said yes. But eventually they're like, no, you got to work your way through this. So I would try to muster up the courage. I would stand at the top of the stairs, about ready to walk down, and I would start running down and run right back up. It was just it took me a little while. And I was telling Cyrus about this, and I was how I was would try to walk into that room, and I couldn't, but sometimes I would run as fast as I could to just get to the light. But then I was also scared of spiders, which was a whole other thing. Had a few fears going on in that season of my life. And I'm telling Cyrus this, and he's 6 years old. He's got this kind of cute little lisp accent, and he just goes, Dad, that's embarrassing. That's literally what he says. I was I'm trying to help you here, kid. Fine, lights off. I'll see you later. I'll talk to you in the morning, right? He literally, I'm trying to have a moment with my son. He's like, that's embarrassing. I would never do that, Dad. And I got over it quickly, and we talked about, just how it's okay, and that ultimately, you don't need to be afraid of the dark. And that no matter what you think, no matter what you feel, no matter what you experience, that Jesus is with you and that we are together. And, so he was okay. I adjusted the lights, it was brighter. And I walked downstairs, ready to move on with my evening. And then 5 minutes later, got the dad, the call again. So I went upstairs. He goes, "It's too bright." I said, "You're pushing your luck here, son." But I adjusted it back down, and we were talking about it, and he was pretty wide awake. That was part of the problem. But he goes, "Dad, next time you don't have to make it quite so bright. Like a little bit of light goes a long way." That's what he said. A little bit of light goes a long way. And so funny in that moment. I was working on this finishing just my thoughts for this teaching. And I just thought about how in that just moment with Cyrus, how this little phrase, this little words he spoke to me actually so captures what I believe to be the heart of Jesus for us and the heart of why John wants to tell you about light and darkness and what it means that Jesus is the light of the world. Because what John is showing us is that what began in Jesus now stands as an invitation to us. And I just want you to know that a little bit of light goes a long way. And that the invitation of Christmas, the invitation of Advent, why do we year after year after year, for generations upon generations, stop and celebrate the birth of Christ? It's because the invitation of remembering how Jesus came for us doesn't just speak to us about who Jesus is. It speaks to us about who we really are too. And John, as he initiates this picture of light and darkness and tells us about Jesus as the true light of the world, now moves throughout his gospel. And in chapter 12, where he gives the last thought on light, he tells us this invitation. This is what it says in John 12. Then Jesus told them, "You are going to have the light just a little while longer." He's talking to his disciples about the reality of his present moment with them. He says, "Walk while you have the light, because before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they are going. Believe in the light while you have the light, so that you may become children of light." When he had finished speaking, Jesus left, and he hid himself from them. And Jesus begins in John 1 of the reality of how he is the light of the world, but where it closes is the heart of John, and it's the heart of Jesus, and it's the heart of God for us. The reality, it's not just Jesus who is the light of the world. We now are invited to become children of the light so that we can partner and join God in all that he has called us to do. John does this beautiful thing where he, in John 1, introduces and foreshadows the direction he's going. It's actually this literary masterpiece. Listen to what he says in John chapter 1. He says, "In him," he's talking about Jesus, "was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." That John is helping us understand something about Jesus, that it is not just that he is the light of the world, but there is something about his nature of the light of the world that has authority over the darkness that rests around us. That John wants his readers to understand, that he wants the church to understand that in the midst of the darkness they are experiencing, there is a power and an authority that can overcome it, but it is only found in the person of Jesus. But then he continues in chapter 1, he says, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or of husband's will, but born of God." So right at the beginning and right at the close of John telling us about light, he's helping us realize that what started in Jesus is now ending in us. that you and I are being invited to join this light, and that we actually find our truest identity in becoming children of the light. What John is saying is there is a light, and it's you. It's you. That this is who Jesus is, and this is what Jesus does. And often we miss it. That he wants to start by revealing something about who he is to us. And friends, can I tell you that I think for the most part, as followers of Jesus, that's the part we get. The part where Jesus reveals who he is for us. But what we often misunderstand is that when Jesus reveals who he is for us, he is trying to get us also to a second place of revealing who we are now called to be for the world. And what starts in Jesus is the light of the world, and Jesus is and will always be the light of the world. But what starts in Jesus in the light of the world was not simply meant to end there. It was meant to move to a place of an invitation. That this light is inviting you to become family. And this family is a family of light, meant to move and continue the ministry and the movement of Jesus in the world. See, what we have to understand is that Christmas, while it is many things, and it is many beautiful things scripturally, many beautiful things, truthfully, many beautiful things culturally, it is many things, but more than anything else, it is one thing. It is a revelation of the missionary God, who is now trying to create a missionary people. Christmas is the revelation of what God's like. And it is a revelation of who we were made to be. And let me tell you this, Christmas is a missionary story about a God who so loved he came to rescue and redeem all that was broken. And now he is creating a family that finds their place in this missionary story. And see, this is what Jesus means when he speaks in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, he's speaking to his followers and to his listeners, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people bring a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good deeds and glorify their Father in heaven. What started in Jesus is an invitation to us. And I just wonder, I put this in front of you. I don't pretend like even if you have a follower of Jesus or you're searching, you've been to church a lot or you've been to church a little, I doubt you have never heard some of these concepts before. But what I'm here to tell you is not about have you heard the phrase, Jesus is the light of the world, or have you heard the phrase how Jesus thinks you could be the light of the world. My question to you is, do you actually have a place to begin to believe him? About what would it mean for your life if you realized the missionary God of the world was inviting you to join him as a missionary in all things? Jesus believes that you carry the light of the world. I wonder what it would look like if we believed him back. See, because when Jesus speaks this phrase, when John talks about the nature of Jesus, he's actually riding into the story, into the language of the entire movement of God from beginning to end. Genesis 1 begins with a light before light was created. Begins with a light before there was any star, or any sun, or any moon. That we now know through John that light wasn't the first act of God's creation. That light was the reality of the incarnate Son, the Trinitarian wonder of God from the beginning, simply showing up. Simply letting the world know he existed. When there was nothing but darkness and void, the light, the very first act of our story was light. Revelation tells us that the very end of our story will be about being restored into the people of God, celebrating in the city of God, where, by the way, the imagery is captured, whether meant to be understood literal or physical, that there is no sun because Jesus will be our light. The light that was our beginning is our light that will be our end. And in the middle is a story about human beings who break away and a missionary God who comes again and again and again and again. You see, this phrase, children of light, there's a place where the scriptures speak to it. You see, God began to move in a family. Genesis tells us that he pulls apart Abram as the first missionary in the world. He takes him out of his home and he sends him to a place that God will show him. And he invites Abram to become the father of a nation. And the promises, Genesis 12 to Genesis 15, is that actually in this story, in this family, that God is going to be a light to the nations. His promise to Abram is that he will bless him to be a blessing. And this blessing is meant to be a revelation of light to the nations. Genesis 15, though, is when Abram says back to God, but God, I don't understand how. I'm old. My wife is old. I have no son. I have no descendants. How? And it's here that God says, Moses, come out. Come out of your tent. I want you to look up to the stars. Can you count them? Because I'm telling you, this is what your descendants will be. In Hebrew and in Greek, there's no word for star. It's just the word for light set in the tone of nighttime. He pulls Abram out of his tent and he goes, Abram, look up. Children of light. This is my promise to you. God calls a first family, a first missionary, and says, will you join me to be a light to the nations? And here is my promise. There will be a family of light through this. God moves, Abram moves to promise, moves to sons, moves to Egypt, moves to slavery, moves to Moses, moves to redemption, moves to the promised land, moves to Joshua, moves to the judges, moves to the kings. And we suddenly see that God over and over and over again is trying to invite his people into understanding who they really are. God trying, moving, asking his people to stand in their identity as light of the world. Eventually it all crumbles. Israel taken over by Assyria, Judah taken over by Babylon. And the final book of the Old Testament is 2 Chronicles. It's not the time period it's writing about. It's talking about the time period of the kings. So it's not the chronologically last book of the Bible or in the Old Testament, but it is the last book of the Old Testament in the time it was written. It's written from a point of exile, looking back on all that God has done. 2 Chronicles 26, this is where it ends. It's recapping all that's happened. And this is what it says, that God over and over again tried to rescue and redeem his people, but their hearts were wicked and their hearts were hard and they kept moving away from them. And this is the last phrasing of the Old Testament. It says, and so there was no more remedy left. Did you know that that's where the Old Testament ends? No remedy left. Nothing more could be done. Well, in us, at least. Because there was a remedy. And that remedy was the coming of a son who would be the true light to the nations, would be the true missionary to the world, and would step into what we as a people never could. But by his authority of stepping into what we never could, he not only began something for himself, he invited us to finally find our place in the story. The true light of the world had made a way for the children of light that Abram saw so many years ago. Linz, Matt, you can come up. I want you to see this, that Paul in Philippians 2 is telling us about this same story. He's writing to his friends in Philippi and he says, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but much now more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act and to order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation, than which you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. Friends, Paul is a good rabbi. He is not making up this phrase on his own. He is now writing to this church in Philippi that has now moved, that start. Can I just tell you the beautiful reality? Philippi, the church in Philippi starts when Paul and Silas get imprisoned and don't defend themselves, are beaten even though they didn't deserve it, even though they had Roman citizenship to stop it. But it's when the jailer might die because the prison is opened up, and if the prisoners leave, it requires his own life. It was part of Roman rule, and Paul stops it. The first convert, right? A jailer who had beaten Paul. His family gets saved. Lydia, a faithful Jewish woman, worshiping by the river, which means the town didn't have a big enough place to have a synagogue. It's where faithful Jews would worship if there was no synagogue in their city. A demon-possessed girl who was walking around being manipulated to prophesy for profit for her masters, radically delivered and saved. This is the first church of Philippi. A jailer and his family, Lydia, and a girl who was demon-possessed, who had been delivered. And Paul writes them and he says, when Abram stood out of his tent, and God said, look up, that there's these lights that are going to be your family. He was talking about you. He was always talking about you. We now get to take our place as the light of the world. Not because we've earned it, but because the one who is the light of the world was always trying to make a family. And Jesus stands and he says, to those who are willing, to those who will receive me, you will become children of light, children of the promise, children of a missionary God. I'll tell you, my heart, it aches for one thing in the midst of all that we do. My life, which is an honor, filled with leadership and teaching and planning and structures and staff and ministries and prayer and counseling and budget meetings and facilities. And I wade through it all with what I enjoy and feel equipped to do, what I don't, and what I feel challenged to do. And I do it for one thing. Because there are people who don't know Jesus. That God has invited us to take on a role as missionaries. And it is we who God has invited to put on display the reality of who he is. And as a church, I just wonder what it would mean, what it would look like if we understood what Jesus actually meant when he stood at that moment on the shore side of Galilee in the Sermon on the Mount, and he looked at those who were listening, and he was saying, this city on a hill, this thing that God's been doing since the beginning, this family that's a light to the nations, this family that has been blessed to be a blessing, this missionary God and his missionary people, it's happening right here, right now in me, and you are invited. Because I'm telling you, what Jesus wanted was that you would first understand this, that Jesus is the light of the world, came to rescue and redeem you. But stop buying the American cultural Christian garbage that stops you there. Because what Jesus, in the midst of trying to show you who he is to you, is now trying to show you who you are to the world through him. A light. You are a missionary. You are part of the family. And I am convinced that when we finally see this, it'll start to change everything we see about ourselves and our future. Let me tell you, the invitation to truly understand who you are as a missionary is a tall one. But that's why I just invite you into what my son said to me. A little bit of light goes a long way. I wonder this Christmas, have you considered a missionary God who wants to make you a missionary people? And what might overwhelm you maybe is just an invitation into a shift of direction. Emily and I, if you've been part of our church family for a while, you know a lot of our stories and past. And Emily and I met on the mission field. We met in Thailand. When I was younger, I genuinely thought the rest of my life would be served overseas. My heart was just gripped that there were people who've never heard the gospel. People who don't have a church. And it was in that season, which surprised me, that I started to feel stirred that I was called to the States, to pastor, to my own people, and I felt deep conflict with it. To be honest, it just felt like I was failing. And I wondered if I was discerning God correctly. Several years in, I'd married, was a youth pastor, walked through college and degrees in biblical studies and pastoral ministry with my wife. And there was a man named Don Gilman who was passed away shortly after this moment I had with him. He was a significant mentor and father in my life, a dad of one of my closest friends. And he was a radical missionary to China and Taipei and the Southeast Asian world. And just so happened we were teaching at the same place at the same time. They had a hospitality house. We were only 2 people staying in it. And it was just like this gift that I didn't know was happening. And it was a week of long nights of conversation. It was here in these nights, I just began to open up my heart to Don. And I said, Don, I just feel like, have I missed God? Like there's churches everywhere in the States. I'm not saying that there isn't need, but like I'm willing to go. And maybe isn't willing enough. Maybe just being willing, you don't even need to hear anything else, but I feel this conflict. And Don was really great to me. Passed away of a heart attack just weeks after this conversation. It was a sweet gift in my life. And I'll just never forget as he pastored me through obedience to Jesus. And he just said, Phil, I actually find it a lot like God to take somebody who would be willing to go to plant him back in the church, to reawaken that willingness to go was always meant to be the heart of the church. And he said, but promise me this. If you never go on the field as a missionary, promise me you'll do everything you can to awaken the missionary heart in your church again. It was a conversation that marked my life. It's why from the beginning of our church plant, we've had this phrase, we are missionaries to our city. Because I believe that what God is trying to do is captivate his church again to our true identity. You're the light of the world. And what God is longing to do is to remind you and to show you that the missionary God has made a missionary family. And I think it's just time that we begin to adjust and let a little bit of light go a long way. Because our city needs a church that just doesn't have the revelation of who Jesus is for them. Our city needs a revelation of what now God has made us to be for our world. You are a missionary. It's Jesus' words, it's not mine. I'm not speaking about your vocation. God has sovereignly planted you in fields and in neighborhoods and roles and in tasks and gifts and responsibilities for one purpose: to proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into marvelous light. Because there are people that God wants to save. And the zeal of the missionary heart of God is beating for his church. That's what Christmas is. And I believe that where you and I would simply come and allow God to do this work in us, to convince us, because all true kingdom activity has to flow from true identity. It's time to believe who he says you are. It's time to come into alignment with what God speaks over you. And I believe where we do that, God will move in power. Will you stand with me? As we close, I've just asked Linz and Matt just to declare, just for one moment, I know we're at time, just a simple place. Can we just put language back to God of his worth and his worship? Prayer teams are going to make their way forward, and let's just close together in this place of worship, and then I'll send you on your way. Father, we just say thank you. Would you do what you long to do? And we thank you that you are the light of the world, that you have come to rescue and redeem. We honor you and we love you. Would you help us see who you've made us to be? In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Listen, if we can come and pray, let us pray. If not, have an amazing rest of your day. May God bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you. May he turn his countenance to you. And may you know everywhere you go this week, you are radically loved by Jesus. God bless you, friends.